At 63, Curtis Wexler still believed that 40 years of loyalty bought a person the right to grow old unafraid. She sat very straight the way her father had taught her, and she wrote everything down. 40 years of grocery lists, mileage logs, and her husband's contracting receipts, all in a hand so neat the bank tellers used to compliment it. People called her quiet. They meant invisible. Tonight was their 40th anniversary. Tonight, Gerald Wexler would tap his glass with a dessert fork, smile at a room of 30 friends, and slide a folder across the cake plate while a phone filmed his wife's face. By the end of this evening, she would lose every key she owned and find the one her husband never knew existed. The man who counted everything was about to learn what he failed to count. But what none of them knew, not Gerald, not the guests already holding up their phones, was this. Curtis Wexler had been raised by a man who kept books for a living, and that man had left one last book she had never read. Her father's name was Hal Bridger, though everyone in Grant County called him Hal. For 31 years, he kept the ledgers for the county, and he could find a missing dollar in a book thick as a hymnal and not sleep until he did. He raised his daughter on numbers. Before Curtis could ride a bicycle, she could total a grocery receipt in her head, top to bottom, no pencil, no mistakes. A number doesn't lie, Curtis, he used to tell her. People lie. Numbers just sit there and wait for you to be honest. She had meant to do something with that. An office downtown, maybe, her own name on the glass. Then she married Gerald Wexler the summer she turned 23, and somewhere in that first year, the plan quietly became his plan. She kept the books for Wexler Contracting instead, for free, for 40 years. Gerald liked to tell the receipt story at parties. He told it the way other men tell fishing stories, with his hand resting on her shoulder so she could not slip away. "You should see her," he would say, swirling his bourbon. Every gas receipt, every box of nails, every $2 coffee going back to Reagan, shoe boxes of them in the spare room. I keep telling her, honey, nobody audits a dead man. And the table would laugh, and Curtis would smile the small smile and refill the bread basket and say nothing. She had heard the joke maybe 200 times. She had also, quietly, caught a double-charged insurance premium, an arithmetic error at the bank that ran 3 years, and the November the propane company billed them twice for the same delivery. Nobody clapped for that. A woman who saves you $400 is boring. A man who spends it is fun. There was one thing Curtis kept that Gerald never teased, because he never noticed it. A small brass key on a frayed string, worn under her blouse, warm against her breastbone. It opened the root cellar on her father's farm, 40 minutes south, off County Road 600 East. Hal had pressed it into her hand the week before he passed, 11 years ago now, and folded her fingers shut over it. "You keep that on you," he'd said. "Not in a drawer. On you." She had thought it was an old man being sentimental. She wore it anyway. 11 years, against her skin, every single day. The farm was a sad thing to look at. A sagging farmhouse, a hog barn that had folded in on itself one hard winter, 80 acres of Indiana dirt that hadn't grown a paying crop since Hal got sick. Gerald had a phrase for it. Whenever the property tax came due or a lawyer's envelope showed up, he waved it off the same way. "The farm's just dirt and debt," he'd say. "Sign it to the county for all I care." So Curtis kept paying the small taxes out of the grocery money and kept filing the odd mail that came addressed to the land. Most of it was nothing. But a few times a year, a check arrived from a company called Brindle Holdings, made out to the Bridger estate. Small amounts. Then, in the last few years, less small. Gerald called it junk and dropped it in the trash. Curtis, being Curtis, fished it out and filed every one in a shoebox by date. She did not know what Brindle Holdings was. She only knew her father would have written it down. So she did too. She remembered the cellar the way you remember a childhood church, cool and earthen, shelves of mason jars, the smell of dust and old apples and turned ground, and high on the back shelf, a flat tobacco tin, a Garrett tin gone orange with rust that her father had told her just once never to open until she needed it. "Need what, Daddy?" she'd asked. She was 12. "You'll know," was all he said. 40 years later, the supper club on Washington Street had a private room in the back, and Gerald had booked it for 30 guests. He'd ordered a sheet cake with their wedding photo printed in sugar, the two of them in 1986, impossibly young. He'd told Curtis to wear the blue dress. For 2 weeks, he had been strangely, carefully kind. Kindness from Gerald, like money, always came from somewhere, and always had to be paid back. The plates were cleared. Gerald stood, tapped his glass with a dessert fork, and the room went warm and quiet the way rooms do for a toast. His phone buzzed once in his jacket. He glanced at it and smiled at something that was not the room and put it away. 40 years, he said, and let it sit. 40 years is a long time to be careful with somebody. A few people chuckled. Curtis folded her hands in her lap. "When I started Wexler Contracting, I had one truck and a borrowed level," Gerald said. "I built every bit of this. The house, the cars, the life. And I learned something about people along the way. There's two kinds." He paused for it. "There's the ones who build, and there's the ones who keep the receipts." The laugh that came was thinner now. A phone or two came up over the centerpieces, the way they do, sensing something. "I'm 65 years old," Gerald said, "and I've decided I'm going to move on while there's still time to enjoy it." He reached under his chair. He brought out a folder, navy blue, with a law office's embossed corner, and he slid it across the white tablecloth, across the cake plate, past the sugar photograph of two kids in 1986 until it stopped against his wife's water glass. Curtis looked at the folder. She did not open it. She did not have to. The tab was typed in a secretary's careful hand. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Wexler versus Wexler. The room had gone silent. Somewhere a phone was still filming. Curtis could see the little red dot of it glowing over Donna Pruitt's shoulder. Gerald was smiling. "Happy anniversary," he said. She did not cry. She would think about that later on the long drive south, how the one thing she had dreaded most simply did not happen. Her hands stayed folded, her back stayed straight. She looked at the man she had fed and filed and forgiven for 40 years, and she heard her father's voice, plain as a church bell. "A number doesn't lie. People lie." "All right," Curtis said. "Just that." "All right." Gerald had expected more. You could see it cross his face, the small letdown of a man who had planned fireworks and gotten a quiet woman reaching for her purse. He had wanted the scene. He had wanted the phones to catch her breaking open. Instead, she thanked the waiter by name, told Donna the cake was lovely, and walked out into the October cold with her chin level and the brass key warm against her chest. What Gerald had not announced at the table, he had arranged weeks in advance because Gerald never spent $1 he hadn't already counted twice. The papers had been signed by his attorney 6 weeks back. The rest was already moving. Curtis spent that night at the Days Inn off the Marion Bypass. $41 paid in cash because something in her father's training told her to hold on to cash. In the morning, she drove back to the brick split level on Bradner Avenue, the only house she had ever kept books in. A stone's throw from the rusting bones of the old Spencer Cardinal plant, where Gerald's own father had once punched a clock. A man in a work shirt was kneeling at her front door with a cordless drill, changing the deadbolt. "Ma'am, I was told the house is company property," he said, not unkindly. "Wexler Contracting. You'd have to take that up with the office." The truck was already gone from the driveway. The sedan she had driven to the motel was still there, but it was titled to the business too. Every car she had ever driven registered to a company whose books she had balanced for free. They would send a flatbed for it inside the week. For now, it was the only thing still hers that could move. She stood on her own front step and called the bank. The joint checking, the joint savings, the little emergency fund she had built 200 careful dollars at a time. She knew those balances the way she knew her own birthday. The teller's voice turned gentle, the way voices do when the number on the screen is about to hurt somebody. "Mrs. Wexler, I'm showing a zero balance on both. There was a transfer out." 2 days ago. 2 days ago. Before the cake. Before the toast. He had emptied her clean while he was still being strangely kind, and then he had bought a sheet cake to watch her find out. By noon, she had a purse, a phone, a blue dress she had worn to her own undoing, and $41 less than the night before. 40 years of marriage had been counted, divided, and assigned, and the arithmetic came out to nothing in her name. The house, the savings, and both cars now belonged to Gerald Wexler, on paper, and in fact, almost nothing, because the man who counted everything had forgotten one line in his own ledger: the sad little farm 40 minutes south, the 80 acres he called dirt and debt, the root cellar nobody had unlocked in 11 years. Curtis sat behind the wheel of the doomed sedan at the edge of Bradner Avenue and reached up and closed her hand around the small brass key against her breastbone. The one thing Gerald had never noticed, never inventoried, never thought to take. Then she turned the car south, toward County Road 600 East, toward her father's farm, to find out what a man who never lied had been trying so hard to hand her all along. The drive south out of Marion was 40 minutes of the same flat country her father had driven his whole life. She took Washington Street out to the bypass, then the old 2-lane that ran past the last of the box stores and into the open, where the corn stubble lay gray under an October sky and the grain elevator stood up on the horizon like the only tall things the Lord had allowed out here. Curtis drove the way she did everything, both hands on the wheel, the speedometer steady, 5 under the limit. The sedan was not hers and would not be hers by Friday, and there was something almost funny in that. A woman driving a borrowed car toward the only piece of ground left in the world that still carried her name. She let herself notice the joke. She did not let herself cry. Crying was a thing a person did when they were surprised, and Curtis was finding, mile after mile, that she was not surprised at all. Somewhere under 40 years of bread baskets and balanced books, a part of her had been waiting for this exact afternoon, the way you keep an umbrella by the door in a county where it always, eventually, rains. She passed the turnoff for the Methodist camp and the spot where the Conoco used to be and the long curve where her father always slowed and said the same thing every single time, that a man who took that curve fast was a man in too big a hurry to get nowhere. She slowed for it now. Habit or grief or both. The two had started to feel like the same muscle. The mailbox at County Road 600 East still said Bridger in the faded stick-on letters Hal had pressed on himself the summer before he got sick. Curtis turned in. The lane was rutted and grown up with chicory, and the sedan complained over the washboard, and then the farm opened up in front of her the way it had opened up in front of her every summer of her childhood, the sagging white farmhouse. The hog barn that had folded in on itself one bad February, its spine snapped, its tin roof peeled back like the lid of a can. 80 acres of good black Indiana dirt that Gerald Wexler had called dirt and debt for 30 years, as if saying it twice made it true. She sat in the car a minute with the engine ticking. The quiet out here was a physical thing. In Marion, there was always the hum of the bypass, the neighbor's heat pump, Gerald's television muttering through the wall. Here there was wind in the dead corn and a far-off dog and her own pulse, and high under the collar of the blue dress she had worn to her own undoing, the small brass key, warm as it always was, warm as a living thing. You keep that on you, not in a drawer, on you. "All right, Daddy," she said out loud, to nobody, to the wind, "all right." The root cellar was set into the little rise behind the house, a hump door of gray boards laid almost flat to the ground, the way the old-timers built them so a twister couldn't get a grip. There was a hasp and an iron padlock, gone the color of dried blood with rust. Curtis knelt in the cold grass in her good dress and lifted the string over her head and held the key up, and her hand was not quite steady, which surprised her because her hands never shook over numbers, and this was, she understood, the most important number she had ever been handed. The key went in. It did not want to turn. She breathed and worked it gently, the way her father had taught her to work anything stubborn, with patience instead of force, and the lock gave with a small, dry cough of rust, and the hasp swung free. The door was heavy. She got both hands under the edge and lifted, and the cool came up out of the dark to meet her, that exact smell she had been carrying in the back of her memory for 11 years. Cold earth, old apples, dust and lime and turned ground. The smell of her father, more than any cologne or pipe smoke, the smell of the man himself. She went down the 4 plank steps into the dark with her phone held up for its little light. The cellar was just as she had left it the week he passed. Wood shelves sagging under mason jars, the fruit inside gone dark and unknowable. A wheelbarrow with a flat tire, a coil of rope, the cool pressed on her ears, and there, high on the back shelf, exactly where it had sat in her memory for 40 years, the flat tobacco tin, a Garrett tin, the lettering long gone to orange rust, the lid sealed down tight. Never open it until you need it. Need what, Daddy? You'll know. Curtis reached up and took it down. It was heavier than a tin should be. She held it against the front of her dress with both arms, the way you hold a thing you are afraid of dropping. And she climbed back up the 4 steps into the gray daylight, and she did not bother with the cellar door, and she carried it across the dead grass and up onto the back porch and into her father's kitchen, where she had learned to add. The kitchen had not changed either. The same enamel table with the chipped corner, the same 2 chairs, a calendar on the wall still turned to a month 11 years gone. She pulled out the chair that had always been hers, the one facing the window, and she sat down very straight, and she set the tin on the table in front of her. She had to work it open with a butter knife from the drawer. The rust had welded it so. She went around the edge slow and even, the way her father went around a column of figures, and at last the lid came up with a sound like a held breath let go. Inside there was a leather book. It was a farm ledger, oxblood leather gone soft and dark at the corners from being handled, the kind the bank used to give out free to men who kept their own accounts. Curtis lifted it out and set it on the enamel table and opened the cover, and the breath went out of her all at once, because she knew that hand. She would have known it anywhere on this earth. The small, upright, patient hand of Hal Bridger, who could find a missing dollar in a book thick as a hymnal and not sleep until he did. Every figure closed, every 7 crossed, every column ruled with a straight edge and fountain pen, blue-black. The ink of a man who never used a pencil because a pencil was for people who expected to be wrong. She put her finger on the first line and read it aloud, the way she had read for him at this table when she was 6 years old, and her feet didn't reach the floor. 1979, she read. March. Loan to G. Wexler, truck, transmission. $1,200. Her finger moved down. July. Loan to G. Wexler, bond on the Henley job, $4,000 even, down, 81. Loan to G. Wexler. Roof, the house on Bradner, $2,800. Note signed, note in the box. Curtis sat back. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the wind moved in the dead corn, and somewhere the far-off dog had stopped. She had known her father lent Gerald money. Everyone's father lent the new son-in-law a little money. That was what the money was for. That was what families did. What she had not known, what no one had ever told her, was that her father had written every dollar of it down. Not in anger. There was no anger in the hand, just the truth, set down plain and ruled and dated, the way Hal set down the price of seed corn or the weight of a hog. A number doesn't lie, Curtis. People lie. Numbers just sit there and wait for you to be honest. She turned the page, and the next, and the columns kept going, year after year. The loans to G. Wexler, the bond money and the truck money and the down payment money, the $400 here and the $6,000 there, and beside each one, in the same patient hand, a small notation, note signed, repaid in full, November. repaid, partial. And then more and more as the years went on, 3 words that began to repeat down the right-hand margin like a bell tolling under the floor of her own marriage. Not repaid, not repaid, not repaid. Curtis Wexler had balanced books for 40 years. She had caught a double-charged insurance premium and a bank error that ran 3 years, and in November, the propane company billed them twice. She had a gift, her father always said, for the place where a number went wrong, a kind of itch behind the eyes that would not let her rest until the 2 sides agreed. And sitting at her dead father's kitchen table in the dress she had worn to her own humiliation, that itch came alive in her, fierce and clean and almost joyful, because for the first time in 40 years, the discrepancy was not hers to apologize for. She read until the daylight in the window started to go thin and gold. She read about money she had never seen lent to a man she had fed every night of her adult life. And she understood, slowly, the way you understand a thing your whole body already knew, that the farm Gerald called worthless was the exact place her father had hidden the proof that Gerald was not. But there was a column she could not read. Near the back, past the loans, there were entries of a different kind, money coming in, not going out, a name she half knew, set down again and again in her father's hand, and then she would realize later in a hand that was not quite his. Brindle Holdings, Brindle Holdings, Brindle Holdings. Sums beside it, small at first, then larger, and she thought of the shoebox on Bradner Avenue, the checks Gerald called junk and dropped in the trash, the ones she had fished out for years because her father would have written them down, and so she had too, never once knowing what she was filing. She did not understand it yet, but she knew who would. Curtis closed the ledger, gentle, the way you close a Bible. She wrapped it back in the tin and she put the tin in her purse, because some instinct older than thought told her this book did not leave her person now, the way the key had never left her person. Then she got back in the borrowed car and drove the 4 miles into the little crossroads town of nothing much, to the only place out here that had been open continuously since before she was born. The feed store sat where it had always sat, a long, low building with a tin awning and a hand-lettered sign, and a bell over the door that had announced every customer for 50 years. Curtis pushed it open, and the bell rang, and a woman behind the counter looked up from a ledger of her own, a woman near Curtis's own age with iron in her dark hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and her face changed the moment she saw who it was. "Lord have mercy," the woman said softly. "You're Hal Bridger's girl." "I am," Curtis said. The woman came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron, looking at Curtis the way you look at weather coming. "Malin Ortega," she said. "I knew your daddy 30 years. I'd know that straight back of yours from the road." Her eyes dropped, just for a second, to the purse Curtis was holding against herself with both arms. Then they came back up, and there was something careful in them now, something that had been waiting. "Honey," Malin said, "you found the book." The bell over the door was still trembling on its bracket when Curtis answered her. "I found a book," she said. "I don't know yet what I found." Malin Ortega looked at her a long moment, and then she crossed to the front of the store and turned the little cardboard sign in the window so the back in 10 faced the road, and she shot the bolt, and the lock going home sounded very loud in the quiet. The feed store smelled the way it had smelled when Curtis was a girl riding along on Saturday mornings. Cracked corn and molasses, sweet feed, and the dry green dust of seed, and clean burlap, and the cold mineral breath off the concrete floor. Sacks stood in their stacks taller than a man. A black iron scale hung from the rafter on its chain. Behind the counter there was a tall metal stool and a wooden countertop, worn pale and soft as soap from 60 years of forearms, and set into the wood near the register, dark with handling, an oval rubber stamp and a dried-out ink pad, and a little embossing press with a notary's seal in its jaw. Sit down, Malin said. You've had a day. I can see it on you. Hal used to wear that same look when the bank did something stupid, like he was already 3 pages ahead of everybody in the room and just waiting on them to catch up. She pulled a second stool around. Sit. Curtis sat. She set the purse on the counter and did not take the tin out yet. Some old caution in her, the bookkeeper's caution, the habit of not showing the whole ledger until you knew who was reading over your shoulder. You knew my father 30 years, Curtis said. I knew him better than that, Malin said. He kept this store open. She said it plainly, the way you state a date or a weight. You want to hear it, or you want to get to your book. I want to hear it. Malin folded her hands on the counter. Her hands were a working woman's hands, scarred and capable, with a wide, plain wedding band gone thin on one side. My husband was named Thomas, she said. Thomas Ortega. We bought this place in 1984 with more nerve than money, which is the only way anybody ever buys anything out here. And we had 3 bad years stacked up like dominoes. The drought year, and then the year the plant laid off half the county so nobody could pay their accounts. And then the winter Thomas got sick and couldn't lift a 50-pound sack to save his life, which out here is the same as not being able to work at all. The note on this building came due, and we did not have it. We did not have a tenth of it. She paused. You know what your daddy did? Tell me. He came in on a Tuesday, bought a bag of mineral he didn't need, the way he always bought something so it wouldn't look like charity, and he laid an envelope on this counter, right about where your purse is sitting, and he said, Malin, I had a good year on the hogs, and I can't think of a thing to do with it that would please me more. And in that envelope was the note, the whole note. He'd gone to the bank and bought our debt off them like you'd buy a calf, and he never said another word about it, not once in 20 years. And when I tried to pay him back in pieces, he'd take the cash, and then I'd find it folded into Tomas's coat pocket on Sunday, like the wind put it there. Malin's mouth worked. So no, I did not know your daddy for fun. And neither did he keep his books for fun, hun. He kept them for somebody. He kept them for the people the numbers were going to have to speak for someday after he couldn't. Curtis sat very still. Outside, a truck went by on the county road and faded. He wrote it down, Curtis said. What he did for you. Course he did. Everything that man ever did, he wrote down. I used to tell him, Hal, the Lord keeps that account. You don't have to. And he'd say. Malin smiled, and her eyes were wet, and her voice dropped into a fair imitation of a dead man's. He'd say, the Lord keeps it, but the Lord don't testify in Grant County Court, Malin. Somebody down here has to. The words went through Curtis like cold water down a back. She thought of the columns in the tin. Note signed. Note in the box. She thought of her own 40 years of dinners and deposits and the receipts Gerald mocked her for keeping, the boring habit, the unpaid clerk, and a thing turned over in her chest that was not grief and was not quite anger, but was made of both, the way the morning out here was made of frost and light at the same time. There's another thing, Malin said, and now she touched the little press with the notary's seal in it, almost without knowing she did. I'm a notary. Been one since the 80s, because out here somebody's gotta be. For the deeds and the titles and the powers of attorney when the old folks go into the home. And over the years, your daddy had me stamp things for him, land things. He'd come in serious with his hat in his hand, and he'd lay out papers, and I'd watch him sign, and I'd put my seal on it, and I never read a word, because that is not a notary's business, hun. A notary swears to the hand, not the meaning, but I'll tell you what I remember. She looked at Curtis. Your name was on more than one of them. Wexler, he wrote, but not for the husband. He'd shake his head when he wrote that man's name any other place. This was the other name, the one you were born with, the girl's name. Bridger, Curtis said softly. Bridger, Malin said. Curtis Bridger. He wrote it careful, like it cost something. Curtis put her hand flat on the worn wood. The reconciler in her, the part of her that her father had built one supper at a time at the enamel table 40 minutes north of here, was beginning to lay the figures side by side. Land things, her name, a book of every dollar Gerald borrowed, and a column of 3 words tolling down the margin. She did not have the whole sum yet, but she could feel its size the way you feel the size of a dark room before you find the light by the echo. "I'd best show you the book," she said. She took the tin out of the purse and worked the lid and lifted the oxblood ledger onto the counter between them. And Maylene Ortega made a small sound in her throat, one hand going to her mouth, because she knew the hand too. Of course she knew it. Half the careful paper in this end of the county had passed under her seal in that same blue-black upright fountain pen. "There he is," Maylene whispered. "Lord, there he is." Curtis opened it and turned it so they could both read, and she did what she had told her father she would always do, what he made her promise at 6 years old with her feet not reaching the floor. She read it out. She ran her finger down the loans to G. Wexler, and read the truck and the bond and the roof and the 400s and the 6,000s, and beside them the small notations, repaid, partial, and then the long descending toll of not repaid, not repaid, not repaid. And Maylin's face went from wonder to something harder and quieter as the years and the figures stacked up. Because Maylin could add too. Anybody who runs a feed store on credit in a poor county can add. And she was watching the same picture come up out of the page that Curtis was watching. The picture of a man who had been carried his whole life by a family he repaid with a sheet cake and a stack of papers on the cake plate. "He borrowed against the farm," Maylin said. "Didn't he? He borrowed on Bridger ground. It's starting to look like he did. And he stood out there at that man's table and called this place dirt and debt." Maylin's voice had gone flat and dangerous. "I heard him say it once, in this very store, buying nothing, killing time while you were getting feed. Dirt and debt, he says, like the whole county couldn't hear him. The debt." She tapped the page. "The debt was always his. He just hid it under your daddy's roof and hoped nobody who could read ever opened the door." Curtis was about to turn the page when the itch came. It came the way it always came. The way it came over the double-charged propane and the 3-year bank error. A small, cold tug behind the eyes. A wrongness in the shape of the thing before she could even say what was wrong. Her finger had stopped of its own accord on an entry near the bottom of the right-hand page. She had read past it out loud without hearing herself. The way you say a word so familiar it goes by invisible. And then the number behind her eyes had snagged on the date and would not let her go on. "Maylin," she said. Her voice had changed and she heard it change. "When did my father pass?" Maylin looked at her surprised. 11 years ago this spring." "You know that, hun. I brought a ham to the house. You don't forget bringing a ham." 11 years ago this spring," Curtis said. She set her fingertip under the line, gentle, the way you'd touch a sleeping thing you didn't want to wake. "Then tell me how my father, who's been in the Bridger plot at Estates of Serenity for 11 years, wrote a payment into his own ledger in his own hand." She looked up. "Dated 3 years after we buried him." The store went very quiet. The black scale turned a slow inch on its chain and turned back. Somewhere in the back among the sacks, a mouse or a settling bag made a small, dry sound, and then nothing. Maylin Ortega did not gasp, and she did not look away, and that, Curtis would think later, was the first thing that told her Maylin had been waiting for this exact question across this exact counter for a long, long time. The older woman looked down at the date under Curtis's finger, and then she looked at the seal press by the register, and then she looked back at the page, and when she spoke, her voice was careful in a brand new way, the careful of a person standing at the top of the cellar steps, deciding how far down into the dark to carry the light. "That," Maylin said slowly, "is the part your daddy told me you'd find on your own. He said his girl would catch it. He said it just like that. My girl will catch the year that doesn't fit, Maylin. She catches everything. She can't help it. It's the only thing of mine she kept." She drew a breath. and he made me promise that when you caught it, I wouldn't just blurt it out and rob you of it. He said the book would tell you in its own order. So I'm going to ask you to do a thing first before I say one more word about whose hand finished that book. What thing?" Malin reached under the counter and brought up a battered metal recipe box, the kind you'd keep cards in, and she walked her fingers back through it and pulled one card and laid it on the open ledger. There was a name typed across the top of it, and a phone number, and the name was 3 words Curtis had been filing without understanding for the better part of 20 years. 3 words off junk envelopes Gerald pitched in the trash, and she fished back out because her father would have written them down, and so she had too. "Brindle Holdings. You file checks from these people," Malin said. It was not a question. Little ones. For years. How could you possibly know that? Because they've been trying to reach this farm for a while now, and the farm's got no phone, and the address on file sends everything to a man who throws it away as junk. Malin pushed the card the last inch across the page until it touched Curtis's hand. "Before I tell you who finished your daddy's book, hon, I want you to step over to that wall phone and call that number and ask them one thing. Ask them what they've been holding for the Bridger place. And then you sit down, because you are going to want to be sitting." Curtis crossed the worn plank floor to the wall phone by the seed rack, a cream-colored thing with a cord kinked from a lifetime of being stretched the length of the counter, and she steadied the recipe card against the plaster and dialed slow, reading each number twice before she let the dial spin home. It rang once and was answered by a young woman with a voice both bright and tired. "Brindle Holdings, how may I direct your call?" And Curtis said, in the flat, even tone she kept for people who handled money, "My name is Curtis Bridger. I'm calling about the Bridger place on County Road 600 East down in Grant County, and I am given to understand you have been holding something that belongs to it." The line went quiet. Then it clicked, and a hold tone hummed against her ear, and Curtis stood with her spine straight and her free hand flat on the cool wall, and did not fidget, because waiting was a thing she was good at. She had waited 40 years. A man came on, older, slow, the careful voice of somebody who had spent a working life explaining mineral leases to folks who only ever called when they were angry or grieving. He asked her to confirm the legal description and the name the lease was written under, and she read them off the card without a tremor, and she heard him go still, the particular stillness of a person watching a thing he had filed under, lost get up and walk back into the room. "Ma'am," he said, "I want to be sure I'm hearing you right. We have been trying to put a living person together with that account for years. We mail the statements and they come back stamped. Or worse than that, they don't come back at all. They just go down a hole and stop. And a producing lease with nobody to receive on it doesn't quit earning, you understand. It only quits being able to pay." And then he told her what it was. "The gas," he said. "The old field that ran under that whole end of the county, the one that built half the brick in Marion back before either of them was born and was supposed to have played out and hadn't, not entirely, not under the Bridger ground." Her father had signed the lease decades back, a small, honest lease with a small, honest royalty, and Brindle had been pumping a modest share off it the whole time and cutting checks against it, quarter after quarter. The checks went to the address on file. The address on file was a tidy brick split level on Bradner Avenue, and the man on Bradner Avenue had been throwing them in the trash for years as junk. The same loud envelopes Curtis used to fish back out of the kitchen bin and file in a shoebox because her father would have written them down. And so she had too, never once opening one, filing the unopened proof of her own fortune in a box under the stairs like a woman pressing flowers. You have likely already started doing the arithmetic in your head, the way Curtis was doing it standing at that wall. You are guessing low. $294,000 and some odd cents, the man said, was sitting in a suspense account with the Bridger name on it. Money the company had been legally unable to release because it had no live payee to release it to. And it had been quietly drawing interest the entire time. And it was not finished. The wells were still turning. There would be more every quarter for as long as the ground gave it up. Payable, he said, reading now, to the Hal Bridger Family Trust, sole beneficiary, Curtis Bridger. He paused. That you, ma'am? It is, she said. Her voice did not shake, but her hand came off the wall and found the edge of the counter, and Malin's hand was already there, warm and rough, closing over it. Curtis set the phone back in its cradle with both hands. Gentle, the way you lay down a thing that might still be alive. For a moment, the feed store was very quiet, the molasses and seed dust hanging in the slatted light, and in the back room through the open doorway, a boy of about 13 had stopped his pencil over a school book and was watching them with the frank stillness of a child who knows the grown-ups are having a real moment and not a pretend one. My grandson, Malin said, following her eyes. Mateo, his mama runs the line over at Spencer Cardinal Knights, so he does his sums here where I can keep an eye on him. She squeezed Curtis's hand once and let it go. Go on back to your numbers, baby, she called, and the pencil started again. Then Malin turned the ledger on the counter and laid her own scarred finger on the entry that had stopped Curtis cold. The payment dated 3 springs after they had put Hal Bridger in the ground, out at the estates of Serenity. You asked me whose hand finished his book, she said. It's mine, hun. Plain as that. That's me, doing my level best to write the way he wrote. She turned a few leaves, and Curtis saw it now that she knew to look for the seam. The place where the upright letters got just slightly rounder, just slightly less sure. A careful forgery of love. Near the end, he called me out to the house, Malin said. Malin, he couldn't hold a pen steady by then, and he knew that man of yours wasn't going to stop borrowing against this place just because the one person keeping count had passed. So he made me promise. Every time anything moved against the Bridger ground, every note that man signed with this land behind it, I was to find out and set it down in the same book, in the same ink, so there'd be no gap in the telling. A record with a hole in it, he said, is just a story, and a story won't stand up in front of anybody. She drew her hand back. So I kept it. 11 years I've kept it, off what came through the recorder and what came through here. Everything that man did to this place is in there, in my hand, after the part that's in his. Then you've read it all, Curtis said, all but the last page. Malin's eyes went soft and stubborn at once. There's a page at the back that's in his own hand, the real one, not mine. He wrote it the last week, and he told me it wasn't addressed to me, so I never turned to it, and I'm not going to start now. That one's yours to read, but not here. She closed the cover with the flat of her hand. You read that one to the man it's about. You hear me. You sit him down and you read it to his face. Curtis drove into Marion the next morning, up to the limestone courthouse on the square where she had paid her father's last taxes 11 years before, and she carried the tin in her purse against her like a thing that needed warming. At the recorder's window, a young man looked up, freckled, no more than 30, with a county lanyard and a wedding band, still bright enough to be new, and when she said the name Bridger, his whole face opened. Wade, he said, putting his hand out. Wade Stroud, ma'am. You won't know me, but I knew your dad, sort of. My folks knew him better. He lowered his voice the way people did when they spoke of Hal, like they were in church. We were about to lose our house on Euclid back when I was a boy. My dad never would say the whole of it, but somebody paid down the worst of the note one winter and asked the bank not to give the name. And the bank, you know how it is in a town this size, the bank told my dad anyhow. He swallowed. What do you need pulled? I'll find it today. I don't care what's stacked up ahead of it. What he found and stamped and certified for her, all of it before the noon whistle blew at the plant, was a trust recorded in the spring of 1991. The Hal Bridger Family Trust, the farm and every mineral and lease right beneath it, conveyed into it whole, and named upon it nothing of her husband's, not one place, no Wexler anywhere on any line of it. Only the girl's name, only Bridger, only her. Gerald could no more have taken this ground in a divorce than he could have taken the moon out of the county sky. It had never been theirs. It had never been his. It had been hers since she was a young married woman who thought her daddy had left her only a tired field and a falling barn. And he had let her go on thinking it, because a thing nobody covets is a thing nobody can take. She called Gerald that evening from the wall phone at the feed store because the farmhouse still had no line. He answered on the fourth ring with the smooth, bothered voice of a man interrupted at dinner, somewhere nice. And when he heard it was her, his tone slid into the easy condescension she had eaten across a table for 40 years. She let him have it. She said only that there was a last piece of the property to settle, something out at the old place the lawyers would want squared before the decree was final, and that it would take 10 minutes of his time. The word property woke him right up. Anything with a dollar attached to it always did. He said he would come down Saturday, and he said it like a man doing her an enormous favor, like the farm was a smell he would have to wash off after. He came in the late gold of Saturday afternoon, the gravel of County Road 600 East, popping under tires that cost more than the feed store cleared in a season. And he got out squinting at the sagging porch and the caved barn with open distaste, in pressed weekend clothes, a man inspecting a problem. Curtis met him at the door of the farmhouse she had aired and swept, and she had the enamel table set, her father's table, the one she had done her schoolwork at as a girl, and on it sat 2 cups and a brown teapot and a plate with nothing fancy on it. "Sit down, Gerald," she said softly. "You've had a drive." He sat the way a man sits when he has decided to be patient with you. She poured. She set the cup in front of him, and he did not touch it. "Curtis, I've got reservations, so whatever this is." "It won't take long," she said, and she laid the first paper in front of him, face up, the brindle suspense statement, the long column, and the total at the bottom. He glanced at it, irritated, then looked again, and she watched the number find him. "What is this?" "It's the junk mail," she said, in the same even voice she used for the propane company and the bank. "No heat in it at all. The loud envelopes you've been throwing away since before your fiancée picked out her countertops. There's gas under this dirt, Gerald. There has been the whole time. That's 4 years of it you put in the trash, and there's more every quarter for as long as the ground holds out." She laid the second paper over the first, the certified trust, Wade's fresh seal still crisp in the corner. "This is the ground you called worthless," she said. "It was put in trust the second year we were married, in my name only, the name I was born with. You couldn't have touched it in the divorce if you'd tried, and you'd have tried if you had ever once read the deed instead of the appraisal." His jaw had set hard now, the color climbing his neck, and he opened his mouth. And Curtis did the thing she had never once done in 40 years at any table they had ever shared. She kept talking, quiet and level, straight over the top of him, until he stopped. "There's one more," she said, and she set the ledger between them and opened it and turned it so the columns faced him, and she put her finger under the first loan in his name. "Read it." He stared at her. "Read what?" "Read your name and the line beside it. Out loud." "You always did like an audience, Gerald. You served me my papers in front of one." His eyes went to the door, to the window, to the cold tea, and there was nowhere in that little kitchen to go. And at last, in a voice gone thin and unfamiliar, he read. He read G. Wexler and the truck. He read G. Wexler and the bond on the contracting license. He read the roof and the 400s and the 6,000s, and beside more of them than he could stand the small, steady mark in her father's hand that meant he had never paid it back. And the further down the page he read, the quieter his voice got, because he was not a stupid man, he was only a vain one, and he could see now what the columns saw. That every brick of the life he had stood up at the anniversary table and claimed as his own building had been borrowed, a great deal of it against a piece of ground he sneered at, ground that turned out to have been hers the entire time. The debt, she said, when he stopped and would not go on. You used to call this place dirt and debt. You were half right. The debt was always yours. You just kept it parked under my father's roof and trusted that the only person who could add it up had stopped being asked to. Then Curtis drew the ledger back across the table to her own side, gentle, and she turned to the very last leaf, the one Malin had never let herself read, and she found there a single line in the true hand, the upright, certain blue-black hand of a man 11 years gone, written the last week he could hold a pen. She read it to herself first. Then she read it to him, because Malin had told her to read it to his face, and her voice did not break, though it had every right to. G owes the girl, she read. See that she's paid. She closed the book. He knew, she said. Before I did, before you did. My father sat in this kitchen, and he knew exactly what you were and exactly what I'd be left holding, and he made sure the holding was the whole farm. She stood. The chair legs whispered on the old linoleum, "Your tea's gone cold. The lane's the one you came in on." He did not shout. There was nothing in that room to shout at. He gathered himself up out of her father's chair with the stiffness of a man who has just felt the floor turn to water under a house he thought was paid for. And he went out past the cave barn to his expensive car, and the gravel popped, and he was gone up the county road toward the life he had taken from her, that was about to come apart in his hands. Because there was more in the matched columns than Gerald's vanity, and Curtis, who had reconciled a double-charged propane bill and a 3-year-old bank error without breaking a sweat, had seen it the first night at this same table. The money he had drained out of their joint accounts in the quiet months before the anniversary had not gone into the business he swore was thriving. It had gone, dollar tracing to dollar, into a balloon note he could not cover, and a condominium up in Carmel titled to a woman half his age, while he pledged a house and assets to the bank as though they stood free and clear. Curtis did not rage about it. She did the thing her father had raised her to do. She made clean copies. She set the ledger down beside the bank statements so the figures lay next to each other and spoke for themselves, and she carried the whole tidy stack to a loan officer's desk and laid it there the way Hal had once laid an envelope on a feed store counter and said only, "You'll want to look at this before the next payment comes due." What followed, she heard secondhand, the way you hear weather. The bank called the balloon note in full and referred the file somewhere quieter for review. A red and white sign went up in the trimmed front yard of the tidy brick split level on Bradner Avenue. The house with the changed locks and the emptied accounts and both cars sitting in the garage. And before the season turned, the house that had been taken from her in a single afternoon belonged to no one named Wexler at all. The man who had counted every asset she owned and seized each one had managed, in all that counting, to overlook the only ledger that could add him up. Curtis did not move back into the farmhouse all at once, but she had the line put in and the porch jacked level and the locks oiled, and she went down the county road from Marion most days that summer in a car that was finally her own. The royalty checks came to the farm now, in her name, the right name, and the first thing she did once the trust released the suspense money was sit at the recorder's window across from Wade Stroud and have him draw up a thing of her own, not a will full of grievance, an account plain and producing the way her father would have built it. She made it out to the schooling of one Mateo Ortega, every year of it, 2-year, 4-year trade, whatever the boy reached for, with Curtis Bridger named trustee and keeper of the books, and Malin Ortega to follow her when the time came. A child in that family was never again going to sit at a card table doing his sums by the grace of a night shift and a hope. On a clear evening in early autumn, she brought Malin and the boy out to the farm. She took the brass key on its frayed string out from under her blouse, the one door her husband had never thought to inventory, and she walked down the cellar steps into the cool earthen dark and set the garret tin back on its shelf with the ledger sealed inside it, his hand and Malin's both, the whole telling, home where it began. Then she climbed up and pulled the cellar door shut behind her. She lifted the string over her own head and looped it over Mateo's, and settled the small brass key against the boy's chest, and smoothed his collar down flat over it. The boy put his hand over it to feel the weight. The books are open now.